that it? Okay. Today we're going to talk about psychology and wind playing, probably brass playing. How many of you are brass players? Okay. I'm a brass player for 30 years, and I teach psychology, and I teach the psychology of learning. And learning has to do with acquiring and changing behavior. Now, we psychologists are very bold in that regard, and we regard behavior as anything that you can describe, anything you can feel, or anything you can observe anybody else, or anybody else can observe you doing. What this really is a graduate course in psychology as applied to a very specialized area of music in 15 minutes. Now, it really isn't too difficult if I do my job right, because there's nothing terribly complicated about concepts if they're simply presented, and so I hope that I'll be able to do that. And insofar as I'm not understandable, you'll tell me. We have to have, however, some common ground in order to start. Is there anybody here who thinks their brains are in their lips? We're in business. Okay. I would like to answer in the course of all of this, and especially with your help, 3 questions. Why is most brass playing taught wrong? Okay. And you see, I don't make my living playing brass, so, you know, nobody can fire me. And at the most profound level that I can ask the question, or it can be answered, how do people learn to make music on a brass instrument? That's number 2. And number 3, what do I have to do to play as easily and confidently as Jake? So we're going to try and answer those 3 questions. You sort of have to take my word for some things. And even if you don't quite take my word for it, I want you to try very hard today to believe me about some things that you normally might not find believable. If this were a course in psychology, I would take the time and explain it and prove that I was right. I'd say prove because in the last analysis, if you don't believe it, it's not true. If it were a test, you'd write down what I wanted on the test, and you'd leave and you'd say that's all wrong. The test is what you really believe. Now, in order to answer my 3 questions, which I assume are of importance to all of us here, we need to understand a little bit of what we come into the world with. What you get from your parents in terms of genes is very simple. You get your physical structure, including your brain structure, and you have heritability of emotions. Now, all of those provide the potential for sensitivity and for intelligence. And everything else that makes you the way you are is a reflection of some experiences that you've had after conception. All of your habits, all of your attitudes, all of these are a reflection of what has happened to you after conception. The things that make you uniquely you are just that. And if you think I'm kidding, let me give you a quick example. Why is it that in every culture, being kind to other people who are in your group is regarded as a highly positive thing? Why? Because in every culture, every single child that's born has had the experience of kindness from other people. That is to say, there is none of us who can survive without nurturing and protection from the elements and care, generally, from someone else. So therefore, we have basic in our system the notion, the experience, that being kind to others is a very good thing. And it doesn't make any difference what culture you come from. Now, sure, things can happen to us that screw us up, that change all that a bit. But basically, that's what we have. Basically speaking, all of the things which make us the way we are a reflection of what happens to us, and the consequences. Very simply put, for we psychologists and we psychologist brass players, and we are all psychologists because everybody deals with psychology all of their lives, so we're all psychologists today. Okay. The world is a stimulus complex. Everything is a stimulus, okay? And when you're in that stimulus complex, something happens, you respond to something, and if the consequences are good, you play a tone, you see a note on a page and you play a tone and you say to yourself, wonderful, then you will subconsciously make an effort to reproduce that tone in that situation. If the opposite happens, it's a horrible tone, or somebody says to you, my God, if that's the best you can do, stop playing, well, you'll make an effort not to do that again. We develop habits. What is a habit? Basically speaking, a habit is the response that we have to a particular situation. You see a printed C, and you do something, and a pitch comes out that we all accept as a C in terms of that printed C. Now, there is a very small group of behaviors that we have, responses that we have, that are not the reflection of conditioning. And those are reflexes. Those are automatic. Most of what we do in the world that is meaningful is a reflection of a habit that has taken on such potency that it becomes reflexive or near reflexive. That is to say, you don't have to think about it, you just do it. How many people here are very conscious of the moving of their jaws when they eat, unless their jaws hurt them? Anybody here? Is there anybody here who could tie their shoes at birth? Don't think about it. Or, some of us, if we've had too much after-meal entertainment late at night, are forced to take care of that very late at night. In the middle of our sleep, we get up and we advance onto a room with a facility in it. We do it with our eyes closed, and we intend with our eyes closed to achieve a certain result in a certain place. Well, we don't think about it except for the result. If I threw something at you, if I threw it into your face, you'd move to block it. Your ability to walk is the same way, and I have a marvelous personal experience in that regard. I have a friend who had polio twice. And the second time he was about 14, and when he was recovering, and he had atrophy of certain muscles, and they hooked up other muscles in his place. He would walk, and suddenly he would fall down and burst out laughing. And I would say to him, Steve, why are you laughing? He says, well, he says, it's very strange. He says, it's hard to explain. But the way they have my leg hooked up now, I'm supposed to take one step forward with one leg, and the other leg I'm supposed to take one step backward, and I move forwards. He says, and sometimes I forget, and I take a step forward, and I fall down. Well, what has happened is there has been a conditioning in his musculature system such that he calls for a product, a response. And his system has been developed to produce something else, and it doesn't work. And so he has to recondition things. What is important in all of this conditioning is this. The habits that we get are mostly important in terms of the affect, the emotion that's associated with them. If you do something in your sleep, you won't get much out of it. If somebody calls you terrible names in another language, you won't have a bad feeling about them, especially if it's in print. The emotional quality is what ties the habit in. And then repeating these habits. Now, the first question, and let me ask you, do people understand what I'm saying? Because I'll try to digress a little bit. Do you understand what I'm saying? All right. Basically speaking, you come into the world with a physical structure, a brain structure that's the basis for intelligence and for emotionality, and basically you come in with a system that's geared for emotionality. What you're emotional about, that's a reflection of your experiences. If you're never hungry, you won't get upset about it. And nobody has to tell you. And nobody has to instruct you about being hungry. Nobody will say to you, well, how will I know when I'm hungry? How will I know when I have a stomach ache? Don't worry. You'll know. These are the basic systems you come in with, and everything else is acquired. And all of these habits that are acquired, the really important ones, come to have the quality of being automatic, reflexive. You don't have to think about them. They just kick in situations, and whether you like them or you don't. We as human beings have a little bit of an edge on that system, and that is that we are, to a limited extent, and those of you who are fond of free will may be disappointed, a very limited extent, we are participants. We are participatory in what we do. We can reflect on what's happened, and we can take some steps to change things. Why is most brass teaching done wrong? If you have a fine player, what can he teach you, he or she? The male pronoun serves for the female gender as well, and the reverse. What can that person teach you? Well, they can teach you by demonstration great playing in terms of great products. Can they teach you about conditioning, especially if they know nothing about it? No. Well, what is it they're going to show you then? Most people can show you things that are physical. There are very few people who can show you magic. So there is a great effort to try to explain in terms of physical phenomenon what the brass player experiences when he plays, he or she plays. And this is what they attempt to convey to the student. And what caps it and makes it work as far as the musicianship goes is they play. And so what you get is the benefit of great products and the hinderment of misinformation. there's nothing else that they can show you, especially if they're really conscientious. And so all of the bad things that they may have picked up will go along with it. I recall hearing Pavarotti say that he was singing with Sutherland one time and he reached around and he grabbed her stomach. He was trying to figure out, and this was a world-class professional, what in the world she was doing for breath support. He didn't know. And yet he was able to sing very well himself. We learned from Jake that the key is wind and song. Now, what does that mean? Well, if you have no brains in your lips and all the playing gets done with your lips, with fuel in terms of air, then what you have to do is you have to send some signal to your lips. Now, what does that mean? It means that you have to call upon a habit in terms of your lips doing certain things. Some people think that they can control their lips. I think that's nonsense. You think you can, but if you really get down to it, you can't. You can control gross things that have to do with how your lips feel. But you can't really control the fine things. So what do? We order these products, and if conditioning has taken place, then we will get the proper note with the proper qualities about it. Now, if you think about it very carefully, the only way that you can get the note to start with is if there is some association with that note that you have in your head. If you take the horn to your mouth and you have a complete blank in your head and no note in front of you, and you start to blow, do you know what will come out? Probably not. Neither does your lip. Okay? Why? Because you haven't given it any help. You haven't indicated to it what habits are going to be required. When we start playing music on a brass instrument, what we do is we develop habits associated with sounds. Too often, however, we are led to believe, in good faith, that we have an instrument to master, and once we master the instrument, then we can make some music on it. That's not true. By the time that happens, you are already handicapped because you have to undo all those habits that are associated with making sounds on an instrument which are not necessarily musical and not necessarily what you had in mind exactly. So all of that has to be undone. Therefore, the best way to start is by attempting to get a sound. And once you get the sound, to refine it by trial and error. That is the most efficient way to get conditioning, and not to start with some notion of making sounds on a vibrating tube and then figuring out how it is you're going to get music out of that. If in your head you have a conception of a sound, it will come out your lips. It will come out of your lips. And if you don't, then the best you can do is get a weak signal, because a note on a page has been associated with your lips doing certain things. And in a flash, if you just blow and look at the notes, the association will be strong enough to make your lips do certain things, and you will get certain tones. If you have what we do, unfortunately, in learning to play is we make all kinds of associations which are irrelevant. We learn from Jake that all of the belly muscles, tight as can be, impede us. And yet we have a notion in all of our existence of the doing of work and the achieving of things by doing physical things. So it's only perfectly natural that if you want a good, strong tone, you have to give it support. And you support it with what? Belly muscles. Okay? We only learn afterwards that that's counterproductive. So we have lots of things to undo, many of us. Now, if we take it for granted that we have been trained to have tight belly muscles or whatever when we play, how do we get out of that? Or we get ourselves set for 4 or 5 seconds before we play, or we pull our faces this way and that, or we only play over here, or 2/3 upper, 1/3 lower, or half and half, or whatever. We have to, most effectively, take ourselves out of the system that we normally function in and find some new system. Okay. And when we have found ourselves a new system, this business of strangeness that Jake refers to, then it will be easier for us to sort of start over again. Is there anyone here who has never had the experience of having an inadequacy, some technical area, and sitting down and determining that they are going to practice through this? They are going to concentrate until it is right and get it right. And you sit there and bang away on it until you're completely exasperated because you can't move it at all. Is there anybody who's never had that experience? Always has success in that? Well, why is that? Because you can't outwit yourself. You have a habit. You're going to be more clever than your habits? Of course not. So what you do is you come in by the back door. You take off a piece of it. You make it strange. You wiggle your way in. And by doing that, eventually you build up a second habit. Here you have habit 1. This is the rotten habit. Now you have a second habit that's pretty functional. And you slowly bring it in to this situation. Okay? Play for your friends so you're a little nervous. Play for people who make you nervous. Play for people who are very critical. Tell yourself it's got to be right 9 times. Okay? And really, if it's not right 9 times, you have to do it again. Okay? And concentrate and concentrate and concentrate on the product using your new habit. And eventually, it will sneak itself in, and it will be competitive with the old habit. Now, it's not enough for you, for all of us to say, oh, that's true. That's true. Because those of us who take lessons from Jake, and it's a sort of a life event. It goes on year after year. We need a little fine-tuning and so forth and so on. What does that mean? And why does that make us different than Jake? Jake, you see, believes it. I mean, he doesn't recite it. He thinks that's the only thing in the world. He absolutely believes it. Now, when you're nervous, and it's a high pianissimo note, are you going to sit there calmly and go, hearing it ringing in your head, just pick up your instrument? He will. You know why? Because he is absolutely confident that that's the only thing that's going to work. Okay? And if it isn't ringing like hell in his head, it isn't going to be there in his lips. But most of us, under tremendous pressure, do what? We start to get physical about the thing. Well, we're setting our chops, and we're preparing our body, and we're taking all that air in, and we're going to have a little bit of control just in case we're wrong when we come in so we can shift it around. Okay? It's true, isn't it? It's true. Well, that's sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, but that's the key to disaster. If it's true that the only thing here are habits that are ordered, then give them the orders and they'll work. It's also true you can't start out there in an exposed public situation, but if you start on the easy stuff and tell yourself you're not going to do the other stuff and try and catch yourself, then one can go a long ways, and then one can start to approach what Jake has in terms of ease. I mean, after all, I'm not saying in terms of his musicality. That's part of his gifts and his experience, part of what is sensitivity, emotional sensitivity, and what he has been exposed to and how he's thought about that. I won't get that, but we should get the pretty close to his ease in terms of reproduction of sound. I mean, after all, this is a guy who's been sick, he's had heart attacks, he's been operated on, his vital capacity is down. He's told us that, he's told me anyhow, his lip hasn't felt good in years. I mean, can't you compete with a guy like that? And he's willing to help. Well, the answer is really starting out with the proper motivation, as he says, the proper thought, the proper signal. And after a while, when you do this, you will pick up little signs that you're doing it wrong because you will hear it in other people. You will start to hear the physical quality of an attack when it's not necessary for the music, it's just necessary for the security of the player. I mean, after all, the note starts someplace and it goes. It's supposed to go full tilt. The note is not supposed to start like this. It's supposed to start like this. After a while, you'll hear it in other people, and you'll hear it in yourself. And you must be brave. You'll find it's very hard to be brave, even in the privacy of your own house, with nobody listening but you. And it's hard. It's like jumping off a diving board, and you're not sure if there's water there. You've just got to send in the signal and blow, and it's got to work. Now, when that really works well, you can't explain it to anybody else except by the ordering of products. Why? Because you have eliminated physical participation in everything. And it's sort of the mechanics of magic. But for we psychologists, there's nothing magical about it at all. This is the reality of life. Everything that we have is built up like this. It's just that we don't think of it in musical terms. We think of employing our physical system in musical terms. Now, he's not real strong. He can't run a quarter of a mile. And he was feeling terrible the other day. And he said in his lecture, he said, oh, well, you know, he says, my mouth is dry. And he said, and you know, I haven't really been practicing for a couple of weeks now. And it was right at the end, and everybody was expecting him to play. And, you know, I just haven't been feeling real well. And somebody from the audience said, ask another question. And so he walked over to the horn and he said, well, so we'll just have to see what it sounds like this. Why? Because he's got a message in his head. So what does he tell you? He tells you his mouth is dry. We'll have to deal with the message. His dry mouth, his habit system will have to deal with his message and do the best it can. And when he played, did you hear him play? How many were here? It sounded all right to me. I mean, you know, I'll put green sleeves in my repertoire. If we will adopt that attitude and we will practice it, then we will improve. We have problems in that we have acquired bad habits. And the changing of bad habits is through acquiring new habits to compete with these bad habits. And eventually, these new habits will take over. And we cannot confront our old habits head on because we cannot outwit ourselves. I mean, unless we're very, very clever and very, very stupid at the same time. So we try to come in whenever we can through the back door, and we use all kinds of techniques. For example, for those of us who have difficulty in high register, play on your mouthpiece. Why? Because it's the easiest thing to play on. You're more likely to get a high note and a higher note and a higher note there. And once it's secure there, all there is the horn. And the horn is nothing more than a vibrating tube. And it can't say anything that you can't say. And it'll never say any more. And my best experience in that regard was the first time I heard Dennis Brain play on a garden hose. And I said, God, that's wonderful. Well, you know, it isn't a Geyer horn, it's just a garden hose. But what he sent in was a great message. Okay. And I think that the greatest lesson that I had in terms of the nonsense of physicality, this may be censored. I came to a lesson one day, and I'm rather fond of my low register, nothing the matter with it at all. And I started to play, and I thought to myself, I wonder if Jake thinks it sounds as bad as I do. And he said, you know, Shelley, he says, you really are playing like shit today. And I said, oh, God. Well, he said, and he's very positive, he said, today's lesson will be how to make good music when you play like shit. Now, I have a tape of that lesson. I do. I tape a lot of my lessons. After about 15 minutes, I was playing fine. I mean, as good as I ever play. Okay. And then he said to me, how does your lip feel? I said, my lip? I really didn't notice. And there it is. It had me concentrating as much as I could on the products that were to be produced and to forget all about this stuff. A great baseball player, a great hitter, even on his rottenest day, will hit the ball more than 50 feet. Okay? You and I may not on our worst day, but he will. After years and years and years of playing, you still can play, even if you feel rotten. You just must demand the most of your habits and not let your habits run away with your fears. If all you send in is fear, then that's all you'll get. Now, I think what I want to do, I'm going to look over to see if I've missed anything that I think is really important. Now, I ask you if you think I've answered the questions or I have some gaping holes, and open it to questions. Because I'm not quite sure what you understand and what you don't, because I'm not sure if I've been able to convey what I've tried to convey. But give me 15 seconds first. I shoot anybody who walks out. Okay. There's one more small, it's not a small thing, but there's one more thing. Listen, we all have personal problems. We have them all of our lives and in every situation. And some days we feel real bad, and we come to the playing theater, whether it's our bedroom or the concert hall or wherever it is, with all the problems of the day. And we all have our personalities to contend with. That's part of the baggage of growing up. And that's why grandparents are always nicer to grandchildren, than they were to their own kids, because they made so many mistakes with their own kids, and this is their chance to undo it. So everybody's a little screwed up, and we take it for granted. And all of us have our personality that sort of sits as a gloss on everything. Okay. But when we play, and when we practice, we have to do our very best to take away all of the problems of the day and to introduce our musical thoughts. Anybody who practices mindlessly will pay for it. What you are doing is, at worst, at very, very best, wasting your time. At worst, you are building up rotten habits. If you think that you can play with a crummy tone, okay, in your practice because you're too lazy to breathe, okay, and expect it to come out beautifully in a concert performance, you're betting on long odds. The only way to get really fine tone for a concert performance is to make sure that in your background you don't have too much rotten tone in your history. Why is it that Herseth has good tone all the time, unless he chooses to affect his tone? Why? Because that's all he does. That's all he does. And he's had his chops knocked out too. He's had his teeth loosened up in a terrible accident. He had his teeth knocked out, didn't he? Herseth?
No, just loosened.
Just
with
loosened.
A brace behind it.
With a brace behind. Now, I don't know if everybody's familiar with him, but I know we all think well of Jake, and Jake says that Herseth is the finest brass man he's ever heard in his life and the best trumpet player alive. So I say that's pretty good. And all he plays is good stuff. And after a while, you know, as Shakespeare says, the habit doth grow by what it feeds on. And if all you do is produce good sound, then even under great stress, it will be very difficult for you to do much else. If you do finger exercises, okay, and there's nothing behind them, when you're under great tension, those finger exercises are not going to show up very well. If, however, you're concentrating on the sound and the coordination with the sound, then when you're under great pressure and you're concentrating on that sound, that background will serve you more strongly than anything else. Because the only thing that you'll have going for you is good stuff. But you have to love the music enough to call it forward in spite of all of the problems of the day. Okay. Would anybody like to ask me any questions?
Is there ever a situation where you are giving, or think you're giving the proper signal, but the lip doesn't respond to it without regard to any sort of physical problem? Is there times when it just doesn't work?
Usually, as far as I know, no, you just have to go to a simpler system. Take the mouthpiece out of your horn. Okay, the horn has all kinds of negative things associated with it, and the mouthpiece is cleaner, and produce the sound on the mouthpiece. Once you've really established that, then you should more easily be able to go to the horn. If it's a question of being a note that's too high, start lower and work up. If it's a note that you can't play soft enough, start loud in the mouthpiece and bring it down. And when you have it at the low, when you have edged into that note at the volume level that's desirable for you, don't let it go. Hold on to it 8 seconds or so. Why? You're building up a habit. You're building up the association between that sound in your head, that pianissimo sound in your head, and the vibrating surface and everything else in the musculature and so forth and so on in your mouth. And when you do that enough times, even though you'll have instances where you suddenly go back to your old system because you've done it 4,000 times, if you will keep it up and concentrate, eventually it will become very prominent. And then when you go for that pianissimo sound, it will be there. Why will it be there? Because you've developed it. There's not much else that can be there. But if you've never developed it, if the best you ever did was wiggle into it once or twice, then don't expect to call it under tension. But if you've gotten down there by any means, and you held it for a while, and your head and your lip learned what it's all about, then you can get it later on. And sometimes, right then and there, and keep doing it. Let me ask, did I answer my questions? You think I answered my questions? Yes or no? Yes. Okay. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
When you have a student with peculiar mouthpiece placement or strange embouchure, how do you isolate that? If you go with just the mouthpiece, that's the same thing again.
Well,
Or
what you have to do is you have to find out where this mouthpiece can be placed on the person's mouth such that the notes can be produced or something like the notes. It is usually a mistake to force somebody into 2/3, 1/3, here, here, or here. It's whatever works. I mean, who says half and half? Where is it written? It's not in the Old Testament. It's not in the New Testament. So what is it? That's somebody's idea. Well, it's somebody else's idea. But the final test is what works. We're not all the same. I tend to play a little bit to the right. The great de France, who was in his heyday in the 30s and the 40s in Chicago as a horn player, I find from Phil Farkas, played over here. Now that was Farkas's teacher. That was everybody's teacher, who was really serious then. Listen, if it works, the test is not beauty. The test is beautiful sound. Same thing with breathing.
You don't really change what you're working with. You just focus the attention on the product and not worry about this. Or basically then you say, play so it sounds like.
That's correct.
And then teach the sound.
That's correct.
And not the
right. Don't teach physicality because you can't go backwards. You can't go from the physical. You can't get a mouth to vibrate so that you produce a musical tone in your head. It only goes the other way. No, really. So what you have to do is you have to, any way that you can do it, start to approximate the sound and see what works. Fiddle around with it. Let the person experiment. I mean, it's all length, thickness, and tension anyhow, and it's all physics. So most people ought to be able to do it. They ought to be able to play high, and they ought to be able to play low. And really, as a horn player, I really learned to play low. I really learned what it was all about when I heard the Vaughan Williams tuba concerto where Jake played, and I said to myself, that's the name it'll register. Just listen real carefully, and you'll get it. And that's the basis of fourth horn for me.
Low to high notes on a brass instrument fit into what you're saying?
Because the more things that you can hook into a stimulus, the more complicated the signal, that is in terms of you, the easier it will be to call on it later on. It's like having 55 hooks on a loop, and all you have to do when you go sailing through the air is get that loop. If you got 55 hooks, you're more likely to get it than anything else. In other words, the more associations there are with that note, the easier it will be to pull it out. You don't think so? No. All right. Wait.
Can you get a little more detailed about how these good habits are developed that we're going to sneak in later? When you were talking about conceiving sounds, and I think Isaac Stern has heard several 100,000 wonderful horn players. And the first time he puts a horn up to his lip, it's not going to sound like any of them.
No, because he hasn't learned how to make sounds with his lips.
Right, okay, that's what I don't, it's in his head.
Yeah,
How does
so-
that habit get into the meat?
Well, what he has to do is he has to learn how to make some noise with his lips and a mouthpiece. Until he does that, until he develops some crudity to start with, he can't go anywhere. Once he develops some crudity by fooling around, he will start to approach the sound in his head, and eventually he will get it. Most of us have a wide range of flexibility in our embouchure and our lips, and we can create a lot of different sounds. When you first start, you can't. When you first start, you can't tie your shoes either, and you don't know any languages. Who here spoke English at birth? Is there anybody who can't speak it now? I mean, without thinking seriously about what each word means, so that, you know, when you have a feeling or something like that, you don't rush to the dictionary and you stand there for a while wondering if the word that you need to express is going to pop in your head so you can look it up, and it'll tell you what it is itself.
Sheldon?
Yeah.
May I add one thought to that?
Yes, please.
As I understand it, you wanted to know how the development would proceed. In other words, the conceptual thought and the development of a physical response. Was that the question? You have to, it was like I mentioned yesterday in the study of physical skills, anything you start that's rather new will start with crudity, and the skill will develop resultant to the concept of, we'll say, imitating a person in a golf swing, or doing a physical maneuver or a dance step. Most anything you start will have crudities to begin with, and it starts to refine based on a computer activity of the human brain. When you start with a concept of sound in your mind, we'll say the teacher has played for the student, or you've heard a wonderful artist and you're imitating, one level of the brain actually conceives the sound. Other levels, if you can think of a scanning device, will take orders from that level. It will start to fire up tissues. They will go into what we call hypertrophy. They will enlarge. They will be able to create changes that will tend to at first give you somewhat inferior sound, but it will keep improving until the product matches the concept. I was studying, I used to sing, and I had to sing in foreign languages. This is while I was at the Curtis Institute, and I had to sing in La Juive in French. There was a bass area, and I couldn't pronounce certain sounds. My teacher would sing in French so beautifully, and it was impossible for me to get the same diction pattern in this foreign language. In about 2 weeks of trying, I was able to do it. I found out many years later, when I was studying anatomy, the anatomy of the oral cavity, the mouth generally, and so forth, that the muscles develop differently according to the languages that you speak. When an American person trying to imitate the French language, there has to be development of certain tissues. It goes through a state of hypertrophy until they are strong enough to create the proper shape. In other words, you have to have excellence in the brain to start with, then give the chance for the, you might say, the computer activity of the brain to allow the muscles to organize in order to give you the result. In the case of what you're describing, there would be a developmental process that must take place, but you would start with the excellence in the brain and gradually create excellence in the product. Would not be there the instant you performed unless you had prior development from other playing. I just thought I would interject that because it's a very important point.
It's fine.
How much of that can be directed, though? You gave the example earlier about embouchures, and maybe that's a good example. How much of that has to be trial and error, and how much of that can you say,
How can you
pull back
direct
the
something
corners
you
a little
don't?
more?
How can you direct anything you don't have any knowledge of? It has to be trial and error. How can you tell your lips to do something which you yourself don't know about yet? I mean, if you've never played a brass instrument, as Stern, I don't think has, then no one can tell you that. You just simply have to fool around until the right thing happens. And when the right thing happens or starts to approach happening, then you will have some indication and you'll know you're on the right track.
That's just the thing. Every one of us, I think, when we started a brass instrument, the first thing the teachers said was, you know, blow raspberries, go
Right.
like that.
Right.
and all of us started going like that. And, you know, there was directed. None of our teachers just said, put the horn up to your lips and think beautiful horn music.
Well, that's we have to start with melodious raspberries.
May I ask this question? We have a lot of people here. I've often had the theory that perhaps the most successful lesson in developing sound concepts would be one in which the teacher makes no verbal comment about the student's performance at whatever level they're playing, but instead just plays what they've just played and say, now it's your turn. I was wondering if Mr. Jacobs has done a series of lessons or entire lessons based on this principle, and how successful does he feel that result is?
I think demonstration is the finest form of teaching there is. In other words, if I were to teach only tuba players, only instruments that I was highly successful with, I would probably talk less and play more. Unfortunately, I have to create mental pictures that would replace, you might say, the physical act of playing the instrument. In other words, I cannot demonstrate for some of my trumpet students when they play much better than I do. On the trumpet, I can play the trumpet a little, or the horn. I have first horn players of different orchestras, first trumpet players. Phil Collins will come in for a lesson with me on trumpet from Cincinnati. Well, it's foolish for me to demonstrate and try to improve on what he's doing, and yet I know there is improvement available. So we paint mental pictures. In other words, we provide stimulus by establishing recall from his prior experiences, by challenging him in various ways where he has to improve along lines which are already very good, and to make them even better, we have to create, you might say, the conceptual thought that will order that based on psychomotor activity, thoughts that will cause tissue to respond. So, as I say, I think you're right when you mentioned that the teacher could just sit there and demonstrate. In fact, Dale Clevenger has been trying this quite a bit lately. We've talked many aspects of teaching over, and he very frequently will just mostly demonstrate to a student, now this is what it must sound like. I frequently go beyond that. Where I can do it, I will play their mouthpiece and their instrument. So the only variable then is the player.
Well, the other thing is too, if one demonstrates and when the student attempts to reproduce what he or she has heard, and the instructor says, "Are you satisfied?" and they say yes, and it is not a good reproduction, then you have to point out some of the differences. And sometimes the teacher will play again, demonstrating to the student how the student sounded, and ask the student, "Do you hear any difference now between the way I just played and the way I played before?" But in the final analysis, it is what you hear, because if you don't hear it, except in a very creative mode, it won't be available for reproduction later on, and it won't be usable as a signal to your lips.
Specific ways you could apply these concepts to the student in building greater endurance?
Well, I would say play and play, but never play to the point where you develop bad habits. That is to say, where you're no longer capable of playing decent music. When you start playing rotten music, all you're doing is building up bad habits. Sometimes you have to play, I mean, in a concert situation, a rehearsal situation, you're called upon to play and your chops are, gone. You have to do the best you can anyhow. But I would say that if you play beyond the capacity to produce reasonable sounds, then your practicing is not productive. It's counterproductive. Any argument?
I didn't hear the question, I'm sorry. I can't hear it very well over here.
If you want to build up endurance, should you play beyond the point where you can play musically? Should you just keep playing no matter what it sounds like?
No, I wouldn't recommend that. I would recommend that you play, and when you're comfortably tired, stop while you still have efficiency and take a rest. Think music in between if you choose, but I would not abuse the tissues in the sense that you can tear down. In other words, if you can assure yourself that you're going to have sufficient periods of rest, such as in doing heavy physical exercise like weightlifting, you put a curve that has to do with the ability to gain strength. That would indicate considerable contraction power, considerable exercise, and then maybe 2 days rest between till you start the next exercise period. On daily practice, as in brass instruments, if a weightlifter worked on a daily basis, his strength curve would be going down instead of up. He would be losing function rather than gaining. You have to have these rest periods. If you're going to abuse your lip, you better make sure that you have time for the lip to recover and heal. Otherwise, I would definitely stop while you're still functional.
Is that answer the question? Anybody else? One last question.
I know several players who work with tape recorders by themselves when they practice.
Good idea.
Is that a productive technique?
Yes.
Do you think it reinforces why can you hear something in the tape that you don't necessarily hear when you're playing it yourself?
Good question.
Because the wonderful idea in your head is not exactly matched by your tone. Well, what happens is we're not always able. And here I have Dennis Brain singing away in my head, and I'm tooting away on my horn. And if I'm really concentrating, I don't hear me that well. I mostly hear what I'm singing out, which is Dennis Brain. Okay? But it's not quite Dennis Brain when it comes out my bell. But it's the best I can do with the best images. Okay? Now, I may be doing some funny things anyhow. I may have picked up some habits that I don't know about. Well, I'm not going to find out about them by singing Dennis Brain, but I certainly am going to find out about it when I hear it. And when I hear it, I'm going to know what everybody else hears. So once I'm attuned to that and I'm playing, I'm going to be conscious of what's going on. It doesn't mean I'm going to be analyzing my physicality. I'm going to be conscious of the product, very conscious of the product and the balance or the congruency of the message that's yelling to be let out through my lips and what my lips are getting out, and I'm going to try very hard to make my lips, through a backdoor technique or some other technique of reproducing this, but not by fooling around with this.
May I add one thought to that?
Yeah.
I think a tape recorder is a marvelous tool. As I mentioned, I think in my lecture yesterday, the brain asks questions and it issues statements. When it asks questions, it's receiving information from sensors, whether it's through the ear, whether it's through your tissues, but there's an incoming message, and the brain is wonderfully adept at learning based on incoming messages. But to influence the external environment, you use motor systems where the brain has to issue statements. When you play for a tape recorder, it becomes an audience. At that time, you are playing just as though you had an audience. The idea is not to be listening to yourself with a great dominance, but to talk to that tape recorder because you know you're going to be able to analyze the product afterward. There's a freedom that comes with this. Sure, it takes time to listen to the playback, and very frequently you'll be shocked at the playback. But you learn from this that the important factor is you should always play with somebody else in mind, just as though you're going to be an actor. And in an actor, you're going to learn to play the role of whatever you want, whether it's a hero's role or a villain, but you learn always to work for the audience. Everything the actor does is based on being realistic to whoever's watching. We have to always work to whoever's listening to us. If nobody's there, it's important with imagination to put somebody there. I always tell my students who are playing, then they're advancing, there's a fellow outside the door with a $90,000 a year job waiting for you if you sound great. And boy, as soon as you make that statement, there's progress right away. If the imagination is good, that it's the importance of this question is simply don't sit and listen to yourself as though you're the audience. You're the storyteller, not the audience. And it's important for any musician to recognize that, in fact, in all art forms, you work for who's going to be the recipient of your art, not yourself.
I want to say one more thing, and then we'll close it off. And it's in this regard. All of our playing, at some level, is done for other people, just as if you would pursue the subject far enough, you would find that there is an aspect of otherness involved in everything that we do. because our earlier experiences have always to do with others doing for us. There is a quality of all of our activity that others may view it, especially activity like this, where the only performance is with other people if you play in an orchestra, and is with an audience. And so the best conditioning that there is in a practice period is, to some extent, to imagine the qualities of playing with others and playing for an audience, which is the storytelling aspect. And if one does that, then the habits that one has of playing will include a measure of playing for others, including an audience, such that when we're called to play in difficult situations, that is the habit that we trot up, not the habit of playing in isolation for our own amusement with no projection or anything else. Thank you all for coming. If I didn't look at the people over there, it's just because I was blinded.